Welcome to Lit Happens, Unpacking Senior English. I'm Adriel.
And I'm Belle.
We're experienced English teachers dedicating to supporting both new and experienced educators in a world in which we are often time poor, to empower our students to excel in their English studies.
If you're an English teacher, like us, navigating this curriculum, then this podcast is designed with you in mind. And our mission really is to break down the complexities by unpacking English nationally.
Welcome back, everyone, to episode 17 of Lit Happens. We're so excited. We're getting there, and we're moving into Noel Pearson's Eulogy, which will be definitely something that you guys are in for a treat, as we have the lovely Belinda here going to be unpacking it for us. It's going to be a real treat. She has a wealth of knowledge when it comes to teaching this text, and I've definitely learned a few things off her. So hopefully, Belle, our viewers will be that excited that, they're going to be popping in comments of surprise and, not even surprise, jubilation, excitement. As,
That's awesome.
Moving into teaching this text this term.
I hope so.
But look, we're looking at Noel Pearson's text, which is, that eulogy for Gough Whitlam, who again was that key figure in Australian politics. And I'm sure you're going to be breaking down the following elements here, looking at, the tribute, its purpose, audience, context, structure, and so on and so forth, in alignment with Module C's rubric. So we're looking forward to that. We'll definitely, without further ado, sort of get into it. So let's start off with the purpose of Pearson's eulogy. What were some of the fundamental points in regards to his purpose for writing and performing this eulogy?
Yeah, sure. So Noel Pearson, a well-known First Nations Australian figure, basically, wrote and presented this eulogy, a funeral speech for to honor the memory and legacy of Gough Whitlam, which was one of our prime minister, I think, in the 1970s. So it's a really good text for Module C because it is non-fiction persuasive. However, I find that there are really good elements of discursive writing and also reflective writing. And I think as we go through the structure and the language, I'll speak about that a bit more. But I think it's a really great text because it has aspects of all those. And also, if you're going to, or I know you probably are starting to program for the new syllabus, you know that the new prescriptions have a very heavy emphasis on a First Nations Indigenous text. And so this definitely could be one of them in that advanced course. But basically, if we're looking at the overall purpose of this speech, Pearson, in his speech and commemoration, he sought to honour Whitlam's legacy. And he does so on, a personal level, but also what he says in his speech has broader implications for Gough Whitlam's policies in, shaping modern Australia, and also in his policies that were in support of First Nations Indigenous Australians. So not only is he paying tribute to a significant leader, but in it he's reinforcing this ongoing struggle for justice and equality in our world. And I think it's what resonates. So it's not just we're honouring, a Prime Minister, a really great one, Gough Whitlam, but what does his legacy have for modern day Australia, and how do we keep hearkening back to some of the ways in which he was, trying to herald injustice and equality. And we know that that's represented because we have some lines where Pearson says, this old man never wanted opportunity himself, but he possessed the keenest conviction in its importance. So very reverential tones here. And when he breathed, he was Australia's greatest white elder and friend without peer of the original Australians. So there's a deep respect that's embedded in the way Pearson is representing Gough Whitlam here in terms of representing that purpose.
Yeah, awesome. Well, you've covered the purpose there quite well. I think it's also important for us to consider, the intended audience for this text here. So who do you think was the intended audience for this eulogy?
So a good thing to cover with students is the idea of the primary audience here. So obviously those present at Whitlam's memorial, and that would be political figures, Indigenous leaders, the general public as well. This was a really big deal. I know, the 1970s were very far removed from our students' own context, but this idea that, the 1970s was a great place of change for Australia. We were really coming into who we are as Australians, and multiculturalism was coming through. So this real sense of fairness and equality. And so that's the audience of the time, who were present at Whitlam's memorial are reflecting on those values that he brought forth. But the eulogy also reaches, a wider audience, particularly in the way that it was covered through the media. Like I said, you can go on YouTube and find great excerpts of him presenting the speech, which I really recommend. It's really great for students to follow that along with the script, because they can feel the evocative nature of that script as well. So, it's aiming to engage all Australians as well in reflecting on the impact of Whitlam's leadership on particularly Indigenous rights. So, before it was on the HSC list, a lot of teachers would have done it if they did, texts or topics like power and freedom, equality, looking at cultural impact, looking at First Nations voices. It's a really important speech in that regard, and now it's on our Module C list. So some couple of quotes that really represent that audience there. He says, "Only those born bereft truly know the power of opportunity." So he's really trying to draw on the audience of, how it felt to be given that power back, how his First Nations people felt. And he's got that really cool allusions to what did the Romans ever do for us anyway. I'll talk a bit more about those allusions and those techniques. But yeah, he's got a range of audience, and a really, I think the reason why this is still on the Module C list is it's really, really universal in that messaging as well.
And it's something for our students to consider, having a vast range of audiences, which their texts, which they compose, definitely to, adhere to. So it's something that, sometimes students can pigeonhole themselves into, just one very niche type of audience, which, come time for the marking, if it's not something that resonates with the marker, they can find themselves in a little bit of trouble. So, having that wider range or wide array of audiences and intended audience is quite important for us to consider, and something that we can garner from, Pearson's eulogy here. Definitely fantastic stuff there. So let's move into context. So how do you think the historical context of the 1970s shapes this eulogy presented by Pearson?
Yeah, sure. If you don't want to spend too long on context for a Module C text, but your students do have to understand the background forces that influence this speech, because again, we want them to see how this speech would be crafted based on that background, so that when students themselves are crafting, they can reflect on what are the contextual elements that are feeding my narrative or my text that's taking shape here. So in that regard, just a few quick things. So, his Pearson's speech is set against this backdrop of significant social change in Australia, particularly for First Nations voices and people. When he's reflecting on the 1970s, when Gough Whitlam was in power, it was marked by movements where there was advocating for Indigenous rights. Whitlam's policies were very positively geared towards the multicultural community as well in Australia. That really, really started to kick off in the 1970s, because by the, from the 1950s, before that, we had that White Australia policy. So you could see this social change in Australia that a figure like Gough Whitlam really tried to embrace. And I think that's one of the things contextually that's representing what Pearson is saying about him in this speech. And so this context, it's not only informing Pearson's own reflections as a child, a First Nations child growing up amongst these policies, but also in a way it highlights the progress that is still needed when we want to achieve justice for all. Because what I really like about this speech is, yes, there are aspects of, justice for the Indigenous people, but there's a real sense of unity for all Australians that Pearson is trying to represent in this speech. That is really powerful in moving forward as a modern Australia. He says, we were at last free from those discriminations that humiliated and degraded our people. So Pearson's really using his voice here. We'll talk a little bit about how he reflects those historical allusions and those facts around his time and around Indigenous history to bring forth that overall message.
And it's something like, I would encourage you, if you are looking at this in the historical context, even move a few years, you said the 1950s there, look at how Australia's sort of freedom rights coincide with the civil rights movements in America. Another time of change here. I think 1965, you have Charles Perkins, who, was the initiator of the freedom rides. I don't think he had anything in particular to do with Gough Whitlam per se personally, but I think it's quite important when we look at the freedom rides. He played quite an important role, especially when it comes to Gough Whitlam. Later on in 1967, there was a referendum there, which established, the Department of Aboriginal Affairs. And I'm sure you're going to, delve into a few ideas here, but definitely very, very important for our teachers and our students, to understand this when it comes to understanding the eulogy. And I love that fact. We're talking about an Australia for all. It's very significant. It's all people, not just one particular group of people. And I think that's something that definitely resonates through Pearson's eulogy here.
Yeah, and it was presented in, 2014, and you think about in the years just before that as well, like you had Mabo, which obviously Pearson will cover it in the speech too, but you had Mabo, you had Kevin Rudd's sorry speech. So you can almost, you could timeline these specific historical events in our Australian history to give students that sense of what inspired Pearson to write what he wrote about Gough Whitlam. So I think you've added some excellent context as well, just to get students in the mindset of what's the tone for this speech and how is that history and context influencing that, the vibe of the speech, as they might say these days.
100%. No, well done. So let's move on now to you've covered the context really well. Let's move on to structure. So what structural elements stand out to you in Pearson's speech that resonate with, our students and our teachers that are listening here?
Absolutely. So when you're looking at this text, you'll see that it falls under the persuasive. It is a speech. It does employ a more traditional eulogy form or structure. So what that usually means is you have that introduction for who we're gathered for. You've got your personal anecdotes, the reflections on the legacy, and then the call to action. And that's what makes it, in the end, a persuasive response, because there is a distinct call to action at the end. And that culminates as a result of all the great things that Pearson, discusses is part of Whitlam's legacy, and therefore that Australia for us all to move us forward. So now the way that this structure works, it allows to create this real emotional resonance. And obviously that, that makes a lot of sense for us as teachers. This is a eulogy. Get your students to think when you are presenting a eulogy or a speech, what do you want to convey? What do you want to say about the person? And not only that, but what do you want to install in your audience? What do you want them to think or feel and leave thinking about that person? So all of those things are playing a role in building the structure and this emotional resonance. But clearly that this message is that ongoing fight for social justice, which is something that Gough Whitlam really was one of the leading figures in. So, we start with that introduction. It's got a very open and respectful tone. It's a very personal tone. Immediately Noel Pearson is trying to establish a non-partisan stance and trying to keep the politics out of it. He says, bequeathed no allegiance to any political party. This is about the person. This is about the figure. And then he goes on to those kind of personal testimonies. Noel Pearson shares many great anecdotes about his own lived experience as a young person growing up in these discriminatory laws, that then Gough Whitlam sort of fought for. And so by having this anecdote and storytelling, he's really enhancing the ethos and the emotional impact. He then starts to move forward now in kind of like a timeline with chronological case studies. So some of the great contextual points that you brought up, Adriel, he uses that to track the speech as well. So key legislative milestones under Whitlam, like the Racial Discrimination Act, like the Land Rights Act, and he's using these historical allusions to really build a sense of the man, the myth, the legend, like what Gough Whitlam was able to achieve. But you have to your students have to understand too how perfectly situated that is, given that this is a state funeral for one of our prime ministers. So it's a very thoughtful in that regard inclusion, having that chronological case study. Then what he does is go into some contrasts and some comparisons. So he actually starts to do a comparison with some of Whitlam's reforms and with some of the other aggressive governance of other political figures in the time, such as Bjelke Peterson. And that juxtaposition there, it's, when we all say students, you place two things side by side, but it allows Gough Whitlam's character to rise up and triumph over, what Pearson is suggesting, some of the lesser figures. In terms of the structure, there's also then, when we get towards the end of the speech, we've got that legacy reflection, and Pearson becomes quite beautifully poetic when he speaks. He's using the repetition and accumulative listing to actually showcase Whitlam's enduring reforms. And I'll go through some key quotes in a moment, but ending with this real philosophical conclusion where there's a reflection on this universal opportunity and justice, and that's where the call to action comes across. And this is what really ties the speech back to, we're talking about Whitlam's moral, personal, political vision here, but it's how it resonates with the final call to action and then works together. So structurally, that's how I would take students kind of through it.
Yeah, and that's awesome. You've given us a good framework there for the different elements of structure that students then can consider in their own craft, which we'll sort of move into here. So how would you describe Pearson's style, I guess, in this eulogy?
Yeah, Pearson's style, wow, what a great writer he is, because he does so much in this speech, and I'll take you through that list now. But I think how I would describe it, it's reverent and it's also passionate, and he bounces between the two really beautifully. There's this weaving that he does with these personal anecdotes and how he uses his own personal story and frames them within the historical allusions and the political references of the time. And I think what that does is enables the audience to really emotionally connect. And he sort of presents the ground for allowing his points to then transcend into the broader narrative of what social life we want for all Australians. And his word choice is also really deliberate, really powerful, which reflects the gravity of the occasion. There's real gravitas when you listen to this speech. It's powerful through and through. So some kind of, I guess, crafting style of this particular eulogy. So we talked about the formal eulogy structure. So just one more thing I'll say about that. You can note with your students where it's quite respectful and solemn in its tone, and then where the tone shifts to more passionate advocacy. I really like this speech and sort of showcasing to students the technique of tone so that they can then consider what they do with it moving forward. There's a real power in the rhetorical devices here. We've got rhetorical questions, we've got listing, rule of three, parallel structures, historical allusions in here are extremely important, including the legal, political, and social events. Anecdote, we talked about. Irony pops up in here as well. It's a real subtle humor that Gough Whitlam, that Noel Pearson is using to connect to Gough Whitlam's own, cheeky humor that he had as well. So like he's got the toga reference in there. And then, we've got our speech, our crafting, our rhetoric, our ethos, pathos, and our logos. So ethos, Pearson really is an Indigenous leader, in our world now still. So he's got this real kind of ethical authority in that regard, which positions him really well to be like this personal beneficiary of Whitlam's reforms and enable him to tell the story of Gough Whitlam from that ethos perspective to hook the audience. Pathos then, so extremely emotionally charged language. We know that he's evoking sympathy, he's evoking admiration. When he's doing the contrast, he's evoking, fear, he's evoking prejudice. There's a lot happening. Logos as well, when he's citing all the legal and political reforms like the Mabo, the racial discrimination. Allusions, he actually also brings in a lot of classical and pop culture allusions to make the messaging universal. And I think this is where some of these techniques align really nicely with discursive writing as well.
Yeah.
So you would have like your allusions, you would have your rhetoric, your pathos, your anecdotes, your facts and statistics. So yes, because this has the call of action, it becomes persuasive, but it's also really nice to play around and take a paragraph or an excerpt with your students and have them soften the tone and the language to make it more discursive. What could they do to shift the form a little bit so that they can see the difference themselves? But in terms of crafting as well, the contrast with the Whitlam and other figures, and also there's a real sense of repetition and rhythm that gives it a very poetic quality as well. I think for me, they're my this is what sets Pearson's Eulogy separate from some of the others that have been in the HSC before.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's some great stuff there. We'll move on to our language features there. So what specific language features, based off of, what we've sort of just mentioned with the style and the crafting, what language features do you think, Pearson employs to enhance his message?
Okay, so when we're going in those language features, we're looking more like quotes within the lines or kind of a line by line as opposed to like a big structural technique. So metaphor, repetition, vivid imagery. So for example, when he's referencing personal history and collective memory, he's doing that by evoking this sense of shared identity. And so he uses metaphor, like when he says the modern cosmopolitan Australia finally emerged like a technicolorful butterfly from its long dormant chrysalis. I mean, that imagery of, breaking free and spreading our wings and, being the Australia we all want to have is such a very rich and beautiful, metaphor, and the vivid imagery and even the diction and the word choice, long dormant chrysalis, like every word in this speech from Pearson is deliberately evocative of some type of emotion. Allusion, he does the Monty Python references, which for the audience of the time would have been a very well-known kind of humorous reference. So he says, and what did the Romans ever do for us? And he's satirically in this way highlighting Whitlam's achievements. So again, that's a bit of a pop culture allusion reference that's getting a buy-in to his speech here. Inclusive language is a huge one in this speech. Every time we are our, us, he's building solidarity to represent the way that Whitlam's policies ushered in solidarity, but he's also doing that to bring in the collective memory and also to build solidarity moving forward in the universal nature of what we want Australia to be. And just a few quick more juxtapositions become very prominent in this speech too. So sometimes he's juxtaposing time, sometimes he's juxtaposing political figures or settings. So that's a really good one. Anaphora, so the repetition of phrases, so where he says only those who, and then he goes in that listing of, only those who have known justice, only those who have known injustice. He goes through that listing. Yeah. And also the idea of the epistrophe, where the repetition is at the end of the clause. And these are very, what we would also refer to as like a speech rhetoric or rhetorical devices. So these are very deliberate, repetitive phrases, really trying to hook audiences in on that message for Pearson. But I think they're some of the good techniques that you'd find. Yeah.
No, that's awesome. Some great sort of language features for our teachers sort of to springboard off of. So if we look at all these sort of ideas of style, language features, we obviously have to frame them around some key ideas as well. So what are some of the central themes that Pearson sort of emphasizes in his eulogy here as well?
Yeah. So this is a really nice speech from Pearson's because there's such a deep connection to people and history, and this need for like continued advocacy for equality, rights, and also the recognition of Whitlam's, I almost called him William, of Whitlam's role in shaping a more just society, that we all want to see. So that's quite a universal kind of message. But if I was breaking it down into thematics, which might be really helpful for your students, sometimes I find I will start off with, here's a list of a few of the key ideas while students are engaging with the speech, so that their brain is already prepared for what they're looking for, kind of quote-wise and technique-wise. So obviously one of the big ones is racial justice and equality. So looking at how Pearson is using, anecdote to represent that, using tone and reference when he calls him the white elder, that is really huge. Legacy and reform, kind of this idea of like the power of people and politics, and honor and service and community. So how legacy and reform can be used to make or break that, particularly with the historical allusions and the legislatures he's representing. A really sweet one, gratitude and remembrance. So there's a lot of lines here where you can feel in the tone how thankful he is for Whitlam and figures like Whitlam who do what they do for the betterment of society. And remembrance obviously is quite pivotal considering it's a eulogy. But I think what I get the students is to think about, what techniques does Pearson employ to allow remembrance to occur? And that's a very delicate balance between your more factual stuff, your anecdote, and then the humor and also the allusions, the pop culture references. And then so moral conviction and our morality and our ethics, and also political courage. Particularly how we live in a time with such political division, this idea of, having an aim and seeing it through because you believe in change, because you believe in your community and in your country. So those are kind of the key ideas that I might frame the speech around, and something to springboard off of. If you want your students to write something, they could kind of springboard off of those key ideas as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's some great stuff. And you've given some great thematic sort of ideas for our teachers to, again, springboard off of. Yeah. So it's well done, Mel.
A few things. There's quite a lot with this, but a few things.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And again, the purpose of our little sort of conversations here is to just get the ball rolling. And then that's probably the important thing. To give you guys a few ideas on what have worked for us. And I guess keeping that in mind, we want to look at maybe how we can incorporate the lessons that we learn from Pearson's eulogy, maybe into our creative, maybe discursive, persuasive responses for Mod C.
Yeah, cool. So I think, now what we want to think about is, okay, we've looked at the speech, students get the ideas, they get some of the structural and the techniques. What do we actually do with it now in terms of the Module C rubric? How do we use that as a way to springboard? Some of the ideas, before I even get into the text type, some of the ideas that I like to work with is this engaging with history and reflecting on really pivotal historical moments. Another one is reflecting on the struggles of marginalized voices. So I really like the idea of a marginalized voice, because it could be really anyone in any given situation. It doesn't kind of pigeonhole you into repeating kind of pre-done stories or stories that you're not really familiar with. It allows this idea of just a marginalized voice, somebody who might lack power or control. And then also the notion of advocating for justice. So when you are going through this with your students, you could engage in discussions like, what makes a political leader's legacy endure? Do you think Whitlam's reforms outweigh his dismissal? I didn't talk a lot about the dismissal in the contextual element, but this depends on your class. It depends. If you've got a class that's very, they're doing modern history, they're very into their political understanding, then maybe legacy and leadership is something that you take them through a little bit deeper so they can start thinking through these discussion questions and help them formulate, their own thoughts before they start writing. What I would also think about is, you can get your students to springboard either out of the techniques or out of the ideas, or perhaps a combination of both. So what you could do is get them to get an excerpt from Pearson's speech and actually get them, like I said, to play around with the tone and the technique so that it becomes more of a discursive piece. So perhaps ending, you could have them reshape the ending of that speech. So instead of having a very distinct call to action, it ends in a more discursive, open-ended consideration moving forward. Also, it might be nice to pull out the bits where Pearson is reflecting on his childhood and on his education that was made possible with some of the policies like free universal education that Whitlam put through, and actually get them to look at those reflective elements and see how Pearson has had to reflect on his own upbringing and his own worldview within Whitlam's policies to then be able to write this speech. Because I think students think like they're all separate. This story is separate and reflection is separate and discursive is separate. But there is like a process that connects all of them, I think.
Yeah.
So that's a good way. So what you could do then is you could give them prompts as well. So this could be discursive prompts where you get them to write something on, empathy through imagination, or a discursive on voice and representation, or a discursive on legacy and leadership, power and policy, creative connections. So that might be a nice springboard, and they could use parts of the speech as some of the students like evidence and allusions, but then they have to create their own anecdotes around that and create their own symbols and metaphors around that. In terms of also creative writing, you could have some prompts. So the prompt could be, imagining you're somebody witnessing the passage of the Racial Discrimination Act and you're writing diary entries on your own personal reactions. You might actually be writing a fictional letter to Gough Whitlam or from Gough Whitlam to a confidant during these times. You might be actually getting them to engage in a conversation across time. Like you might be crafting something where Noel Pearson meets a young activist who listened to his speech and now is engaging within the principles of what his speech was about. So I think the beauty of this speech is because I think for my students, because it's a speech and in their mind kind of separate, they can springboard off the ideas and then turn it into whatever they like. So I think there's a lot of possibility with this kind of speech. And it's got the First Nations perspective, which we know is something that we need to get our students meaningfully engaging with.
Yeah, no, definitely for the new sort of syllabus coming up. So no, you've got some great sort of ideas there and good, foundational elements there for our teachers to sort of work on using Pearson's Eulogy here. And, it's been a fantastic sort of unpacking. You've gone through some great key ideas, features, structure, style. So thank you for that for today. It's been wonderful just listening to you speak through this and, giving us those insights as to how we can apply this in our classroom as well, which is significant. But I think that brings us to the end of another episode here. Once again, guys, thank you so much for your support. Be sure to like and subscribe our pages, follow us, and once again, I didn't mention this. If you have any comments, please leave the comments on our Spotify sort of episodes there. Just give us a good idea as to what you guys want to listen to, what you want to hear more of. We will be doing a few more Mod C texts and probably moving into a few skills as well as we start to prep ourselves for trials coming up as well in the next few weeks and months. So, it's an exciting time. Keep your heads up, teachers, students, if you're listening, keep your heads up as well. Don't drop off. I think it's very important. It's a sort of a crucial time now where we can sort of either go down or up. So definitely, encouraging you guys to do so. Thank you once again for everyone with your support, and keep an ear out for more episodes. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.